In the summer of 1993, the worst flood in 150 years drowned most of Kankakee County, Illinois. The county extension agent had 11 moisture sensors across the county, the most comprehensive monitoring system in the state. Every sensor said the same thing: don't plant the creek ground. It's drummer silty clay loam. It floods. Leonard Kessler planted it anyway. Not because he ignored the science. Because in 1956, his father had dug a tile line and hit gravel 24 inches down, gravel that wasn't on any map, wasn't in any sensor, wasn't in any database. His father spent 40 years watching that gravel. Then he spent 3 days telling Leonard exactly what it meant. In the flood of 1993, those 3 days were worth $12,000. The question is, what happens to the farm on the other side of the fence, where the same gravel exists, but the father died before he could finish the conversation? Prologue: what maps cannot hold. A map is a generalization, and the land is specific, and between the generalization and the specific there exists a gap that is sometimes small and sometimes large, and that only becomes visible in the years when the difference between the generalization and the specific is the difference between a harvest and nothing at all. The county soil surveys that the Natural Resources Conservation Service produces are among the most carefully prepared documents in American agriculture. The result of decades of field survey work, laboratory analysis, and systematic classification. They tell you the soil series, the drainage class, the parent material, the expected behavior under various moisture conditions. They are useful and they are largely correct. But a survey is made at one moment, by people who can only observe what is visible at the surface and what can be inferred from standard probe depths, and the land changes over geological time in ways that left features beneath the surface that no standard probe would reach. The survey is the best available record of what was findable when the surveyors walked the field. It is not a complete record of what is there. Paul Dreyer had spent 3 years building a moisture monitoring network across Kankakee County, Illinois, that was based entirely on the soil survey. 11 sensors. 8 soil series. The most comprehensive real-time drainage assessment system that any county in the state extension network had deployed. In the summer of 1993, he would learn that the most comprehensive system in the state extension network could not see what a farmer's father had found with a tile spade in 1956. This is not a story about the failure of Paul Dreyer's system. It is a story about what his system could not see, and about what it took, for 2 generations of one family and one extension agent willing to be taught, to make the invisible finally visible. Paul Dreyer drove the county roads on the 3rd Monday of May 1993, which was the latest he had ever begun his spring moisture assessment tour, and what he saw as he drove told him that this was going to be a year that tested everything he thought he knew about Kankakee County's agricultural land. He was 34 years old and had been the county extension agent for 3 years, coming from the University of Illinois with a strong background in agronomy and a genuine commitment to the work. He was a careful man, methodical in his thinking, the kind of professional who arrived with preparation and updated his preparation when the evidence required it. The spring had been wet from the beginning, not dramatically, not with the kind of catastrophic storms that made the news, but consistently, persistently, in the way of a season that is decided to be wet and intends to continue. The soil moisture sensors he had installed at 11 locations across the county were all reading at or above field capacity for the drummer silty clay loam series that dominated much of the county's cropland. His driving assessment was consistent with the sensor data. Fields that should have been approaching planting readiness were still saturated, with standing water in the low spots and surface crusting on the drier areas that indicated moisture cycling at the surface rather than drainage through the profile. He was composing, as he drove, the county moisture advisory he would publish at the end of the week: planting conditions not recommended for drummer silty clay loam. Soil moisture at or above field capacity throughout profile. Recommend delay of all field operations minimum 14 days. This was the correct advisory given the data he had. He did not yet know what the data he had was missing. Leonard Kessler had been farming 480 acres in Kankakee County for 36 years, and he drove his fields on the same Monday morning that Paul Dreyer drove the county roads, and what he saw was different from what Dreyer saw, not because they were looking at different things but because Leonard was looking with information that Dreyer did not have. He was 61 years old, lean and deliberate, with the specific quality of movement of a man who has learned that farming punishes inattention. He stopped the pickup at the corner of the field he called the South 40 and pressed his hand flat on the soil surface. Soft but not saturated. He could plant this field by the end of the week. He drove to the river bottom and got out and did not need to press his hand on the soil because he could feel the give in the ground through his boots from the first step. Not ready. Not close to ready. He drove to the creek ground. The creek ground was 60 acres that ran along the south bank of a small tributary that the Kessler family had called Slater Creek for 4 generations. It was mapped on the county soil survey as drummer silty clay loam, the same series as the river bottom that was clearly weeks away from planting readiness. Leonard pressed his hand into the soil at the northwest corner of the creek ground, pressed and lifted slowly. There was a pull. A slight but perceptible suction, the sensation of soil that was draining actively, not just sitting wet. He wrote in his notebook, "Creek ground NW, surface wet, draining actively. Could be plantable ahead of schedule. Subsurface gravel drainage confirmed active. Watch carefully." The words subsurface gravel were the key. They referenced something that was not on the soil survey, not in Paul Dreyer's sensor network, not on any map that anyone outside the Kessler family had ever seen. They referenced what Leonard's father had found with a tile spade in 1956. Robert Kessler had farmed the same 480 acres from 1947 to 1981, and in the October of 1981, before he retired and handed the operation to his son, he had spent 3 days walking the farm with Leonard. Not to show Leonard where things were, Leonard had grown up on this land and knew it as well as he knew his own face. Robert walked to tell Leonard what he knew about what things were, the specific, observation-based knowledge that did not appear on any map and that could only be transmitted by a person who had accumulated it to a person who would need it. On the second day of the walkthrough, Robert stood at the west edge of the creek ground and said, "The soil survey says this is drummer silty clay loam. Poorly drained. High water table. The survey is correct." He paused and looked at the field. "But the survey doesn't show what's underneath the drummer." Underneath the drummer, in about a 60-acre pocket that runs from the northwest corner to about 2/3 of the way to the creek, there's a layer of glacial outwash gravel at about 24 inches. It's not on any map. I found it in 1956 when I dug a new tile line and hit gravel 6 inches below where I expected clay. Leonard had looked at the field. "The gravel acts as a lateral drain," Robert said. "In a normal wet year, the creek ground drains slower than the South 40, but it drains. In a bad flood year, a year when the creek is running full and the tile doesn't drain because the outlet is underwater, the gravel carries water horizontally to the creek channel faster than the clay around it can hold it." He looked at his son. "In the year of the flood, the creek ground will be the last field to plant. But it will also be the first to be ready after the water recedes. And if you plant it before the window closes, if you plant it when the gravel is actively draining and the surface is borderline, it may be the only 60 acres that survives." Leonard had written this in his notebook that evening, in his father's words as closely as he could remember them. 12 years later, in the wet May of 1993, standing at the northwest corner of the creek ground and feeling the pull of active drainage through the gravel, Leonard remembered those words exactly. He also remembered the second part of what his father had said: "In the year of the flood, plant the creek ground before the extension recommendation allows it. Wait and you will lose it." The moisture monitoring network that Paul Dreyer had built over 3 years was the pride of the Kankakee County Extension Office. 11 sensors, each connected to a data logger that reported daily to the Extension Office's computer. 8 soil series covered. The capacity to produce, in real time, a drainage condition assessment for each major soil type in the county. When he had demonstrated the system to the state extension director the previous fall, the director had described it as the future of county-level agricultural guidance. Dreyer had believed this. He still believed it, in the sense that he believed the system did what it was designed to do and did it well. What he had begun to suspect, as he drove the county roads in May 1993 and stopped at farms and talked with farmers who knew their specific fields in ways that his sensors could not capture, was that the system was designed around the soil survey, and the soil survey was not a complete description of what was in the ground. He had stopped at Leonard Kessler's farm on the 3rd Monday of May, partly as a routine check-in and partly because Leonard was the farmer in the county most likely to have something specific and useful to say about his fields. "I think the northwest portion of the creek ground may be plantable ahead of your recommendation," Leonard said, without preamble. Dreyer looked at the creek ground, at the flat, dark surface that looked, from the road, identical to the river bottom that was clearly not ready. "The sensors on drummer silty clay loam are showing field capacity or above across all 11 monitoring locations," Dreyer said carefully. "The creek ground is mostly drummer silty clay loam," Leonard said. "But there's a glacial outwash gravel deposit at about 24 inches across the northwest 60 acres. It's not on the soil survey." Dreyer listened to this with the attention of a man who is hearing something that doesn't fit his framework and is trying to decide whether the framework or the information needs revision. "How do you know about the gravel deposit?" he asked. Leonard told him. "The 1956 tile excavation. 40 years of Robert Kessler's observation. The 1981 walkthrough. The specific prediction about flood year behavior. Dreyer was quiet for a moment. My recommendation has to be based on the sensor network data, he said, which shows drummer silty clay loam at field capacity. If I tell farmers it's acceptable to plant drummer silty clay loam, I'm responsible for the outcome on every drummer field in the county. I'm not asking you to change your recommendation, Leonard said. I'm asking whether your system has any way to account for subsurface conditions that aren't on the soil survey. It doesn't, Dreyer said. He said it simply, without defensiveness, because it was true and he understood it to be true. The sensor network is based on the published soil series. If there's a subsurface condition that modifies drainage behavior, the sensor network won't capture it. Leonard nodded. I understand, he said. I appreciate you being clear about that. Dreyer drove to the next farm. But he thought about the conversation for the rest of the day, in the specific way that he thought about things that revealed gaps in what he understood. A 60-acre gravel deposit, found by a farmer digging a tile line in 1956, existing in his coverage area and not on any map and not in his sensor network. He thought, what else is in this county's ground that I don't know about? He had no way to answer the question. He had no data to answer it. His sensor network, the most comprehensive in the state extension system, could not tell him what it was not measuring. Dorothy Kessler had been married to Leonard for 37 years, and she understood his knowledge the way she understood his character, not because he had explained it to her but because she had watched it operate over 4 decades and had learned what it could and could not do. She understood that when Leonard said the creek ground might be plantable ahead of the extension recommendation, this was not wishful thinking or contrarianism. It was a specific, observation-based, documented prediction derived from his father's 40 years of field records and his own 12 years of continuing observation. She also understood something about the spring of 1993 that Leonard had not said directly but that she had inferred from the almanac and the Weather Service reports and 37 years of watching Kankakee County weather. The window was not going to extend. Wet springs in this county that persisted into June did not become dry summers in which late planting could recover. They became flood years. She said this to Leonard on the Sunday before he planned to begin planting. You need to plant what you can plant and accept what you can't, she said. And you need to make the decision about the creek ground before the window closes, not after. Leonard looked at the weather maps between them on the kitchen table. My father's instruction was to plant the creek ground when the gravel is actively draining, regardless of what the surrounding drummer fields look like. Is the gravel actively draining? I've checked it every other day for 2 weeks, Leonard said. The pull is there. It's draining. Then plant it, Dorothy said. This is what your father's 3 days were for. Leonard planted the northwest 60 acres of the creek ground on June 3, 9 days before the window the extension recommendation described as the minimum for drummer silty clay loam planting. The rain came back on June 9 and did not stop. The rain that came on June 9 was different from the rain that had come before. The weather patterns that Dorothy had been reading were connected to a persistent atmospheric ridge over the western United States blocking the normal eastward progression of weather systems and deflecting moisture-laden air from the Gulf of Mexico into the Midwest in a pattern that had not occurred at this scale since 1947. The meteorologists would explain this later. In June 1993, what Leonard and Dorothy knew was that the rain felt purposeful, the kind of rain that knows what it is doing. By June 12, Leonard had driven the county roads and seen what the rain was doing to each of his fields. The river bottom, not a field. A lake, flat and still and reflecting the gray sky, with the corn he had planted in late May visible in rows just below the water surface. The South 40, holding, barely. The slight elevation was keeping the water at the field edge rather than over the planted corn, but the water was 2 inches below the surface and one more day of significant rain would bring it over. The north ground, holding better, higher elevation. The creek ground northwest 60, Leonard drove along the south edge and looked. The water table was rising, he could see it at the field edge, but the surface of the northwest 60 was still above water. The gravel layer was doing what his father had said it would do, carrying water laterally to the creek channel, keeping the rooting zone above saturation even as the water rose everywhere else. He wrote in his notebook, June 12. River bottom, lost. South 40, marginal, watching. North ground, holding. Creek ground NW, holding. Creek ground SE, flooded. Paul Dreyer called that evening, doing his flood assessment rounds. How are you set? Dreyer asked. River bottom is gone, Leonard said. South 40 is marginal. Creek ground northwest 60 is holding. Dreyer was quiet. The creek ground. which is mapped as Drummer Silty Clay Loam. The Northwest 60 has the gravel deposit, Leonard said. How many other farmers in the county have subsurface conditions like that? Dreyer said. He wasn't asking Leonard specifically. He was thinking out loud, and Leonard could hear that he was, hear the specific quality of a man whose framework is being revised in real time. I don't know, Leonard said. I only know about mine because my father found it. And your father told you, Dreyer said. Yes, Leonard said. In October of 1981. After he hung up, Paul Dreyer sat at his desk in the extension office in the dark and thought about what he didn't know about Kankakee County. The sensor network data was complete, all 11 monitoring locations were reporting, and the report was unambiguous. Drummer Silty Clay Loam was saturated across the county. His advisory had been correct given the data he had. The data he had was missing 60 acres in the northwest corner of the Kessler Creek ground. It was missing whatever else was under the county's fields that no tile spade had found yet. The South 40 held until July 4. Leonard drove the field edge that morning and saw that the water had crested the field boundary in the southwestern corner during the night. An area of approximately 15 acres was underwater. He walked to the field center and looked at the remaining corn. Stressed, yellowing leaves, stunted growth, the symptoms of anaerobic root conditions, but alive. The standing water was confined to the southwest corner. The remaining 65 acres were still above water. He made a decision that was not in any extension bulletin. He would wait and watch the South 40 daily. If the water level stabilized, the remaining 65 acres had a chance. If it continued to rise, the corn would be lost and there was nothing to do about it. The water stabilized on July 7. It began to drop on July 12. By July 20, the southwest corner was out of standing water. The corn there was dead. 16 days underwater was past the point of survival. But the remaining 65 acres had survived. Stressed, behind in growth, certain to yield below average, but alive. He wrote in his notebook on July 20, South 40, 15 acres lost, 65 acres surviving. Yield estimate, 60 to 80 bushels per acre. North ground, good condition. Creek ground NW, good condition despite stress, estimate 70 to 90 bushels per acre. Total harvestable acreage, approximately 180 acres. He showed Dorothy. She calculated, north ground was 120 acres, south 40 surviving was 65, creek ground northwest was 60. The yields would not be normal. But there was something to harvest on each of these. The creek ground northwest 60, she said. Without your father's knowledge, would you have planted it? No, Leonard said. I would have followed the extension recommendation. I would have waited. And by the time the recommendation allowed planting, the window had closed. So those 60 acres exist because of him, Dorothy said. Because of what he observed and what he wrote down and what he told me, Leonard said. Yes. Paul Dreyer spent the flood months of June, July, and August 1993 doing what extension agents do in flood emergencies, driving the county, assessing conditions, collecting data, filing reports. But he was also doing something that was not in his job description, because his job description did not have a category for it. He was building, in a separate notebook that he did not file with the official reports, an account of everything he was learning about the gap between his sensor network and the actual agricultural land of Kankakee County. The account was specific. He had visited 47 farms by the end of August. On 11 of those farms, he had encountered situations where the farmer's specific, field-by-field knowledge of drainage behavior diverged from what the soil survey and his sensors would have predicted. In 6 of those cases, the divergence was small, a field draining slightly faster or slower than its mapped soil series suggested, differences within the normal variation of the series. In 5 cases, the divergence was significant, fields behaving materially differently from what the map showed, in ways that could not be explained by normal within-series variation. Of the 5 significant cases, 3 involved subsurface features that the farmers knew about from their own experience: a buried drainage channel here, a gravel lens there, a hardpan layer that created a perched water table in ways the survey did not capture. 2 involved features that the farmers had noticed, anomalous drainage behavior, but had not explained. And one of the 5 was the Kessler Creek ground. The Kessler Creek ground was unique because it was the one case where the subsurface feature had been found, documented, observed systematically over 40 years, and transmitted explicitly to the next person who would need to know about it. In the other cases, the knowledge was partial: a farmer who had noticed something but not understood it, or understood it but not written it down, or written it down but not told anyone. In the Kessler case, the complete chain was there: observation, documentation, understanding, and transmission. And the transmission was what had made the 60 acres plantable in 1993 when everything else was flooding. Dreyer wrote in his separate notebook, on a Friday evening in August, the sensor network is correct for the soil series it measures. It does not measure what is beneath the soil series. A farmer's 40-year observation record can contain information about what is beneath the soil series that no standard survey would find. The question is how much of that information exists in this county and how much of it has been transmitted to the people who are currently farming. I don't know the answer to either question. I don't have a method to find out. I need to think about this differently. He had been thinking about his work for 3 years as a problem of data collection and communication. The sensor network collected data. The extension advisories communicated conclusions from the data. The advisories were only as good as the data, and the data was only as good as what the sensors could measure. He had not previously thought about his work as a problem of knowledge archaeology, of finding and recovering the observation-based knowledge that existed in the minds and notebooks of farming families and that no sensor had ever measured. He did not know how to do knowledge archaeology. He had not been trained for it. He thought he should learn. The harvest of 1993 on the Kessler farm was not a normal harvest. Normal harvests had a quality of completion, the orderly reduction of fields from standing crop to bare soil, the grain tank filling and filling, the rhythm of a machine doing work it was built to do. The harvest of 1993 was a salvage operation. Leonard ran the combine through the surviving 180 acres at a pace dictated by grain moisture levels that required drying and by field conditions still soft enough to limit how aggressively he could run the machine. The yields. North ground, 120 acres, 102 bushels per acre. Down from the 168 he had averaged in normal years, the flood stress and late-season moisture had compressed the grain fill period, but a real harvest. South 40 surviving, 65 acres, 68 bushels per acre. The root damage from the near flooding showed in every ear, smaller, lighter, with the particular pale color of grain that had not finished properly. But there. Creek ground northwest, 60 acres, 87 bushels per acre. Better than the surviving South 40 despite the creek ground's reputation as difficult ground, because the gravel deposit had kept the root zone above saturation even in the worst conditions, and the roots that had stayed in aerobic soil had kept working. He wrote the final numbers in his notebook on October 14. North ground, 120 acres times 102 bushels equals 12, 240 bushels. South 40, surviving, 65 acres times 68 bushels equals 420 bushels. Creek ground NW, 60 acres times 87 bushels equals 220 bushels. Total, 880 bushels. Normal year total, approximately 65,000 bushels. Percentage of normal, 33.7%. He showed the numbers to Dorothy. She looked at them for a long time. Then she did a different calculation, one that Leonard had not done. If you had followed the extension recommendation, she said, and not planted the creek ground northwest 60, what would the total have been? Leonard looked at the numbers. 12,240 plus 4,420, he said. 16,660 bushels. Instead of 21,880, Dorothy said. 5,220 bushels more, Leonard said. Because of the 60 acres. Because of your father's 60 acres, Dorothy said. At the price corn was trading when you sold. She did the arithmetic. Approximately $12,000. Leonard was quiet. In the worst year of your farming life, Dorothy said, your father's 3 days in October of 1981 were worth $12,000. Paul Dreyer came to the Kessler farm on the last Monday of October, after the harvest was finished. He brought his separate notebook, the one with the account of the gap, and a recording device, with Leonard's permission. They spent 3 hours at the kitchen table with the Kessler family notebooks. The notebooks went back to 1947, Robert Kessler's first year farming the property. Dreyer read the key entries himself, and Leonard showed him the system Robert had used, the notation method, the observation categories, the way the notebooks built on each other year by year. The entry from 1957, 1 year after the tile excavation. May 19, 1957. Creek ground NW corner, probe at 24 inches shows gravel continuing at least 200 feet south and 150 feet east of the tile trench. Gravel layer 6 to 14 inches thick, appears to be old channel fill. Connected to creek drainage, field drains noticeably faster after rains than the drummer ground around it. We'll monitor over following years to understand extent and behavior. In the entry from 1965, after a moderately bad wet spring. June 12, 1965. The creek ground NW60 is dry enough to plant when the river bottom and the south part of the creek ground are still too wet. This is the gravel layer drainage at work, carrying the water laterally to the creek instead of holding it in the profile. In a normal year, this doesn't matter much. In a bad year, a flood year, the NW60 may be the only plantable ground on the farm. This is worth knowing. This is what I will tell Leonard when the time comes. Dreyer read this entry twice. Then he looked up. He wrote it for you, Dreyer said. He knew he was going to tell you and he wrote the entry so the record would be there whether he was or not. He was careful that way, Leonard said. The observation, the documentation, and the explicit transmission, Dreyer said slowly, as if he were organizing something in his mind. All three. Most farmers I've talked to this summer have one or two. You have all three because he built the whole chain. What happens when someone has only one or two? Leonard said. Dreyer was quiet for a moment. He thought about the 5 significant cases in his separate notebook. It depends on which one is missing, he said. If the transmission is missing, if the person dies or has a stroke before they can tell the next person, the observation and the documentation exist but nobody knows to look for them. The knowledge is technically present and practically lost. Ed Garrison's father, Leonard said. Who? Leonard told him about Ed Garrison, about the conversation at the fence in July, about Ed's father who had noticed the anomalous drainage in the north portion of the east field and had begun to tell Ed in 1985 before the stroke in January 1986 cut the transmission short. Dreyer made a note. The Garrison East field is adjacent to your creek ground, he said. On the other side of the fence, north portion might be the same gravel deposit, Leonard said. My father's probe work suggested the deposit might extend that far. I want to go look at the Garrison East field, Dreyer said. And I want to do a systematic probe survey of this whole drainage area, your creek ground, the Garrison East field, everything in this creek watershed, to find out how far the gravel deposit actually extends. It should have been in the original soil survey, Leonard said. It should have been, Dreyer said. The survey was done in the 1950s. The survey crew didn't find it. Your father found it by accident, because he was digging a tile line in exactly the right place. He looked at the notebooks on the table, the 46 years of observation that had built from that tile line excavation in 1956. I want to use these, he said. Not just for the mapping project. I want to use your father's methodology as a model for what systematic field observation looks like. Because what he built here is more useful than anything I collected with the sensor network this year. And I need to understand how he built it so I can help other farmers build it. Leonard looked at him. That's a bigger project than the mapping, Leonard said. Yes, Dreyer said. It is. Leonard and Paul Dreyer walked to the Garrison East field fence on the Tuesday after the October meeting. Ed Garrison met them there. Ed was 63 years old and had been farming the adjacent land for 40 years. He was a careful man, quiet, with the particular reticence of someone who has recently learned something uncomfortable about his own history with this land. My father noticed this field drained differently, Ed said, standing at the north edge of the east field. He always planted the north portion earlier than the rest of the field. He said it was better drainage. I assumed he meant better tile coverage. He may not have understood it any better than that, Leonard said. But he observed the outcome, the different drainage behavior, and acted on it. That's not nothing. It's not enough, Ed said. Dreyer drove his soil probe at multiple points across the north portion of the Garrison East field. At 22 to 26 inches, at 4 consecutive probe points from west to east, gravel. It's the same deposit, Dreyer said. It continues across the property line. Ed Garrison looked at the probe cores. So my father was observing the gravel drainage and acting on it without knowing that's what he was doing. Yes, Dreyer said. And his knowledge died with him, Ed said. His practical knowledge survived. You knew the north portion was somehow different, even if you didn't know why, Leonard said. But the specific understanding of why, and what it meant in a flood year, that didn't survive. Ed looked at the field where the crop had died in 1993. The north 40 acres, he said. If I had planted them before the window closed, Dreyer did the arithmetic quietly. 40 acres at the yield the Kessler Creek ground northwest produced, around 87 bushels per acre. About 3,500 bushels. At 1993 prices, roughly $8,000. $8,000 that the stroke took, Ed said. The three men were quiet for a moment. What do I do now? Ed said. You write it down, Leonard said. What your father noticed. What you've observed about the north portion since you've been farming it. The probe results from today. You put it in a notebook and you keep adding to it, and you tell your son or your daughter or whoever farms this land next, explicitly, what the north portion is and how it behaves. I don't keep notebooks, Ed said. You should start, Leonard said. Paul Dreyer contacted the University of Illinois Extension Service in November and arranged for Dr. Margaret Voss, a soil scientist specializing in soil genesis and drainage systems, to come to Kankakee County for 2 days in December to conduct a systematic probe survey of the Slater Creek drainage area. Dr. Voss drove probes at 100-foot intervals in a grid pattern across a 200-acre area centered on the Kessler Creek ground. She worked with Dreyer and with Leonard, who walked the grid with them and noted, at each probe point, what his observations about drainage behavior predicted about what would be found. His predictions were accurate at 82% of the probe points. The gravel deposit was more extensive than Robert Kessler's 1957 mapping had suggested. It ran approximately 7 miles from northwest to southeast, following the line of Slater Creek but at a depth that suggested it predated the creek by thousands of years. Along its length, it underlay portions of 6 different farms. On 3 of those farms, the gravel deposit was known in some form. On the Kessler farm, known since 1956 and fully documented. On the Garrison farm, known as anomalous drainage behavior but not understood. On the Wilkins farm, where a tile line excavation in 1978 had found gravel, though the Wilkins family had not connected it to flood year drainage implications. On the remaining 3 farms, the gravel deposit was unknown. The owners had been farming over it for decades without any knowledge of its existence. In the spring of 1993 flood, the Kessler farm had 60 acres that survived because of the gravel. The Garrison farm had 40 acres that might have survived but were not planted because the knowledge was incomplete. The 3 farms where the gravel was entirely unknown had lost their drummer silty clay loam acreage without ever knowing that some of it had subsurface conditions that might have led to a different outcome. Dr. Voss prepared a formal soil mapping report. She described the gravel deposit as a buried paleofluvial channel, an old meltwater stream channel from the Wisconsin glaciation, filled with sorted gravel and then buried under several thousand years of lacustrine sediment. She proposed a new soil map unit, drummer silty clay loam, outwash substratum variant, with a description of the drainage behavior distinguishing it from standard drummer. The map unit was incorporated into the county soil survey the following year. When Dreyer told Leonard, Leonard said, "My father would have liked knowing it has a name." What would he have said about it? Dreyer asked. Leonard thought for a moment. He would have said that naming it is useful but not sufficient. That a name in the soil survey doesn't tell you what 40 years of watching it tells you. He would be right, Dreyer said. Ed Garrison called Leonard in the spring of 1994, the first planting season after the flood, with something he had found in his father's things. I went through his notebooks this winter, Ed said. He kept them. I didn't know he kept them. What did he write? Leonard said. Not as much as your father. But there's an entry from 1961. He was digging a new field drainage ditch and hit gravel at about 2 feet. He wrote about it. He knew it was there. Leonard waited. There's another entry from 1973, Ed said. He wrote that the north portion of the east field would drain faster than the rest of the field in flood conditions. He used that exact phrase, flood conditions. He understood it was specifically relevant in flood years. He understood the mechanism, Leonard said. He understood enough of it to write it down correctly, Ed said. What he didn't do was tell me in time. A pause. He started to, in 1985. He walked me through the farm, the way your father walked you through yours. We got through the north ground in the river fields and the west acres. He hadn't gotten to the east field yet when the stroke happened in January. He ran out of time, Leonard said. He ran out of time, Ed said. The knowledge was in him. The knowledge was in the notebooks. But the notebooks were in a box in the attic and I didn't know to look for them because I didn't know he kept them. Leonard thought about this. You know now, he said. I know now, Ed said. For what it's worth in 1994. It's worth the next flood year, Leonard said. Which will come. Yes, Ed said. I suppose it will. After he hung up, Leonard sat at the kitchen table for a long time. He thought about the chain of observation and documentation and transmission that his father had built, and about the incomplete chain that Ed's father had left behind, and about what the difference had cost in 1993. Then he wrote in his notebook. April 18, 1994. The observation is not enough. The record is not enough. Knowledge must be transmitted explicitly to be useful. Ed Garrison's father found the gravel. Ed Garrison's father wrote about it. Ed Garrison didn't know to read it because he didn't know the notebooks existed. Robert Kessler found the gravel. Robert Kessler wrote about it. Robert Kessler told Leonard what the notebooks contained and why. Leonard read it. In the flood year, it mattered. The transmission is the critical step, and transmission requires deliberate effort and time and the understanding that the observation must be explained, not just recorded. Tell Mark what the notebooks contain and why. Don't wait until he needs to know. He underlined the last line. In November 1993, Dorothy Kessler sat at the kitchen table and did the accounting she always did after a difficult year, the complete accounting, the one that showed not just what happened but what it had cost and what it had been worth. The losses: the river bottom, 80 acres, total loss. The south 40, 15 acres, total loss. The remaining 65 acres of the south 40 at reduced yield. The general farm economics of a year in which the operation had produced 21,880 bushels against a normal 65,000. The survival: the north grounds 120 acres, the 65 surviving south 40 acres, and the creek ground northwest 60. She was trying to understand the creek ground northwest 60 specifically. Without the gravel deposit, without the 1956 tile excavation and the 40 years of Robert's observation and the 3 days of the 1981 walkthrough, those 60 acres would have been treated as standard drummer silty clay loam. They would not have been planted when Leonard planted them, in the narrow window before the rain returned. They would have been lost. At 87 bushels per acre times 60 acres times the 1993 corn price, approximately $12, 440 in grain that existed because Robert Kessler had found a geological feature and documented it and then sat down with his son in October of 1981 and explained it. She showed Leonard the calculation. Your father's knowledge was worth $12,000 in 1993, she said. In the year it mattered. In the 20 years between when he told me and the flood, it didn't cost anything and it didn't produce anything, Leonard said. It just waited. Knowledge that waits is not the same as no knowledge, Dorothy said. Every spring you checked the creek ground, you were using what he told you. You knew what the drainage behavior meant. You knew whether the gravel was active or dormant. That knowledge informed every planning decision you made for 20 years. I never needed the flood decision until 1993, Leonard said. But you had it ready, Dorothy said. That's the point. You had it ready because he made sure you had it. Ed Garrison's father had the same knowledge and didn't have time to finish making sure Ed had it. And that's why Ed lost 40 acres that he might not have lost. She paused. The $12,000, she said. That's not what the knowledge was worth, that's what the specific decision in 1993 was worth. The knowledge itself, the 40 years of observation, the transmission, the readiness, that doesn't have a dollar amount. It's the reason the decision was possible. Leonard looked at her. That's a different kind of accounting, he said. Yes, Dorothy said. It is. Paul Dreyer wrote the county flood damage report that the state extension office required, the standard document, the official accounting of losses and affected acreage and crop insurance implications. He filed it in February 1994. He also wrote a second document that he did not file with anyone. He called it, in his private notebook, What the System Couldn't See. The document had 3 sections. The first section was an honest accounting of the sensor network's limitations as revealed by the 1993 flood. The network was accurate for the soil series it measured. It did not measure what was beneath the soil series. It could not have detected the gravel deposit under the Kessler Creek ground because the gravel deposit was not in the soil survey that the network was built from. The network performed exactly as designed and produced accurate information about a description of the land that was incomplete. The second section was an accounting of what the gap had cost. On the Kessler farm, the gap had not cost anything because Leonard Kessler had information that the gap did not affect. His father's 40-year observation record had given him knowledge that the soil survey and sensor network did not have. On the Garrison farm, the gap had cost approximately $8,000 because Ed Garrison had incomplete knowledge of a feature that his father had found but had not fully transmitted. On the 3 farms where the gravel was entirely unknown, the gap's cost was harder to calculate. Those farmers had made decisions based on complete information about their mapped soil series, which was the best information available to them, and had lost acreage that they could not have known to plant. The third section was the one Dreyer found most difficult to write. It was titled What I Would Do Differently. He sat with it for 3 evenings before writing anything. What he would do differently was not, he concluded, to build a better sensor network. The sensor network had done what sensor networks could do. The limitation was not in the sensor technology but in what the sensors were measuring. The published soil survey, which was itself based on surface observation and standard probe depths that had not been sufficient to find a buried paleofluvial channel. What he would do differently was to understand, from the first week of his first year in any county assignment, that the official land records were incomplete, that the completeness of the records depended on what observations had been made over the history of that land, and that the most valuable observations were often in the private notebooks and the oral traditions of farming families who had been paying attention for generations. He wrote, "The sensor network I built is useful. It is also bounded by the map it was built from. The map is bounded by what was findable when the surveyors walked the field. What was findable at the surface in the 1950s does not include what is findable at 24 inches when a farmer digs a tile line in exactly the right place." Robert Kessler's 40-year observation record contains information about Kankakee County's agricultural land that is not in any official database. Some portion of this kind of knowledge exists in the notebooks and memories of farming families across this county. I have no systematic way to find it, because I was not trained to look for it, and my job description does not include looking for it. This is a problem. It became visible in 1993 because the flood was large enough to make the gap between the map and the land consequential. In most years, the gap is invisible. It is always there. He did not publish the private document. He kept it in his notebook. But he acted on what it said, in the way that he could act on it as one extension agent in one county. He spent the following 2 years systematically visiting every farming family in the county that had been operating on the same land for 3 or more generations, asking whether they kept observation records, and asking whether there were things about their specific fields that they knew to be different from what the soil survey showed. He found 4 more cases of subsurface features not on the soil survey. He mapped all 4 and submitted mapping revisions to the NRCS. He also, in each case, asked the farming family to explain to him, and to document in their own records, the history of how they had found the feature and what they had observed about it. He was doing, imperfectly and at small scale, the knowledge archaeology he had decided he needed to learn. Leonard Kessler walked his son Mark through the farm in the fall of 1994, the year Mark turned 17. They spent 3 days on it. Not because the farm required 3 days to walk but because the knowledge required 3 days to transmit. Leonard started with the creek ground. He stood at the northwest corner with Mark and pressed his hand into the soil and asked, "What do you feel?" "Wet," Mark said. "Cold." "Feel for the pull," Leonard said. "The suction. If the soil is draining actively, there's a slight pull when you press and lift. If it's just wet and not draining, there's no pull." Mark pressed and lifted. "There's a pull. Slight." "That's the gravel," Leonard said. "It's conducting water laterally to the creek channel. When you feel that pull, this corner is draining faster than the surrounding drummer clay. In a flood year, when the surrounding clay is flooded, this corner may still be plantable." He told Mark about the 1956 tile excavation. About the 40 years of observation his grandfather had built. About the 1993 flood and the 60 acres that had survived. About Ed Garrison's father and what had been lost. He showed Mark the notebooks, not just the entries about the creek ground but the methodology behind them. The regular observations, the specific notation system, the practice of recording what was actually seen rather than what was expected. "My grandfather started this," Leonard said. "He kept notebooks from 1947. I kept them from 1986. When you farm this land, you keep them." "What do I write?" Mark asked. "Write what you observe. Not what the agronomist says you should be seeing. What you actually see." He paused. "And write it so that whoever reads it after you will understand not just what you saw but what it meant." "How do I know what it means?" Mark said. "You won't always know when you write it," Leonard said. "Your grandfather observed the creek ground for 8 years before he wrote the 1965 entry that explained the flood year implication. The observation came first. The understanding came later. Write the observation, even before you understand it." Mark looked at the northwest corner. "What if I die before I can tell the next person?" Leonard looked at his son. He was 17, and the 1993 flood and the Ed Garrison story had put in the air a kind of awareness that 17-year-olds did not normally have. Then the notebooks have to be enough, Leonard said. So write them so the notebooks are enough. Write them so that someone who doesn't know what you know can read them and find what you found. He paused. Your grandfather wrote the 1965 entry knowing he would tell me about it, but also writing it so that if he couldn't tell me, I could find it. He built both. Both, Mark said. The telling in the record, Leonard said. Both. Neither is sufficient alone. They walked the remaining fields over the next 2 days, and at each field Leonard described what he knew about it, not just the soil series and the drainage tile layout and the yield history, but the specific observations his father had made and his own observations since, the anomalies and the patterns and the things that would not be obvious to someone who had not spent time paying attention to this specific land in this specific county in this specific pattern of seasons. Mark took notes. At the end of the third day, walking back to the farmhouse in the October afternoon, Mark said, "Is there anything under the other fields? Like the gravel?" Leonard was quiet for a long time. "I don't know," he said. "Your grandfather found the gravel by accident. I've been watching for similar features on the other fields for 12 years and haven't found anything comparable. But the gravel was invisible for years before it was found." He paused. "There may be things under this land that nobody has found yet. How would I find them?" "The same way your grandfather found the gravel," Leonard said. "By working the land carefully and paying attention to anything that doesn't behave the way the map says it should behave. And by digging when you have the chance." In the spring of 1996, Leonard found something he had not been looking for. He was digging a new drainage tile line in the southeast corner of the creek ground, the portion that had been flooded in 1993 and had not survived, to improve a low area that had always been slow to drain in spring. At 28 inches, the tile spade hit something that was not clay. He stopped and probed carefully. Then he got the hand probe from the truck and drove it at multiple points in the area. Gravel. Not as extensive as the northwest deposit, perhaps 15 to 20 acres in total, thinning out quickly to the south and east. But gravel, at 26 to 30 inches depth, unmistakably. He sat on the edge of the excavation for a long time. A second pocket. His father had not found it because his father's tile work had not taken him to the southeast corner. 40 years of observation on the northwest deposit had not revealed it because the drainage behavior of the southeast area, while slightly better than surrounding Drummer, had not been dramatically different enough to notice in normal years. In 1993, the southeast corner had been flooded. If this second pocket was as effective a lateral drain as the northwest deposit, it would have behaved similarly under flood conditions, possibly kept some of those acres above water. He would never know what 1993 would have been with that knowledge. The flood was past and its outcomes were fixed. What he knew was what he had always known: the map was not complete. The observation was always partial. The land knew things that the observer had not yet found. He wrote in his notebook. June 4, 1996. SE corner of creek ground, gravel at 26 to 30 inches. Approximately 15 to 20 acres. Separate from NW deposit. Drainage implications, will observe through next several wet years before drawing conclusions. The map is incomplete. There may be more. Tell Mark. He underlined tell Mark and drove home. Paul Dreyer transferred to Champaign County in 1996, 3 years after the flood. Before he left, he prepared a transition document for his successor, a document that went beyond the standard Extension Office files. He spent 2 weeks on it. The document included the mapping report on the buried outwash channel and the 4 additional subsurface features he had identified in his 2-year knowledge archaeology effort. It included a recommended protocol for systematic engagement with farming families who had long generational histories with specific fields, and it included a section he had written and rewritten many times. The County Moisture Sensor Network provides accurate real-time drainage condition data for the soil series covered by the County Soil Survey. It does not provide information about subsurface conditions that are not reflected in the soil survey. The 1993 flood demonstrated that such conditions can exist and can materially affect flood year outcomes. 5 subsurface features have been identified in this county that were not in the published soil survey when I arrived. All 5 have been mapped and submitted for incorporation into the survey. There may be additional features that have not yet been identified. The most effective tool for identifying such features is systematic engagement with farming families who have maintained detailed observation records of their fields over multiple generations. Such records exist in private notebooks and in the memories of older farmers. They represent a form of knowledge about this county's agricultural land that is not available from any official source and that will be lost if the farming families who hold it are not engaged before the knowledge is no longer transmissible. The Kessler family in the northern part of the county has maintained the most complete observation record I encountered, notebooks dating to 1947, with systematic documentation of subsurface drainage features and field behavior across multiple seasons. Leonard Kessler is the current farmer and has agreed to continue sharing this record with the Extension Office. His son Mark will eventually take over the operation and has been introduced to the observation methodology. I recommend that the incoming agent visit Leonard Kessler in the first month of their assignment, read the notebooks, and treat the Kessler observation record as a baseline for understanding what systematic field observation looks like. The sensor network is a tool. The observation records are a different kind of tool. Both are necessary. Neither is sufficient alone. He gave the document to his successor, a young woman named Sarah Mather, who came from Iowa State with strong preparation and a genuine openness to learning what the county knew that her training had not covered. She read the document on her first day and drove to the Kessler farm the following week. Leonard showed her the notebooks. She stayed for 4 hours. The flood of 2019 came faster than the flood of 1993. The bomb cyclone that hit Nebraska and Iowa in early March deposited extraordinary precipitation onto frozen ground that could not absorb it, and the water ran off into the drainage ways in volumes that the levee systems had not been designed to handle, and within days the Missouri River and its tributaries were at levels not seen in 60 years. The Kankakee system, 400 miles east, responded more slowly. It was a response to snowmelt and sustained spring rain rather than direct cyclone impact, but by the third week of March the soil conditions in the county were as saturated as they had been in the worst weeks of 1993. Leonard Kessler was 87 years old in the spring of 2019. He was not farming. He lived in the same house with the same view of the creek ground, and he still walked to the machine shed most mornings because the machine shed was where the notebooks were, 66 years of them now, his father's from 1947 through 1981 and his own from 1982 through 2001 and Mark's from 2001 forward. Mark called on the first Saturday of March. "Dad," Mark said, "the Slater Creek is coming up fast. What should I plant if I have a window?" Leonard thought about this. He thought about the notebooks on the shelf. He thought about the 1965 entry his father had written, the one that explained the flood year implication. "Creek ground northwest corner," he said. "In the southeast pocket. Those are your priorities. The extension recommendation is don't plant anything on Drummer until the advisory clears," Mark said. "I know," Leonard said. "The northwest corner is not behaving like standard Drummer. Press your hand into the soil in the northwest corner. Is there a pull?" A pause. Mark had gone out to the field. "Yes," Mark said. "There's a pull." "The gravel is active," Leonard said. "Plant when the surface temperature hits 50 degrees. In a flood year, plant when you can plant." "You always waited for 55, Mark said. "I waited for 55 because I had a full window," Leonard said. "In a flood year, plant when the gravel is draining and the window is open." Mark planted the northwest corner and the southeast pocket on March 12. He noted in his notebook, March 12. Creek ground NW and SE pocket, planted per Dad's guidance. Gravel active. Extension recommendation not yet cleared for Drummer. Dad says plant anyway. The flood crested on March 17. By March 20, the creek ground northwest corner and the southeast pocket were the only two planted areas on the Kessler farm that were not underwater. Mark called Leonard that evening. "They're still above water," Mark said. "Yes," Leonard said. The gravel, Leonard said. "Doing what it has always done." A pause. "Your grandfather found it in 1956, Mark said. "He found the northwest pocket in 1956, Leonard said. "I found the southeast pocket in 1996. There may be more that neither of us has found yet." "I've been watching," Mark said. "Nothing yet." "Keep watching," Leonard said. "Write it down if you see anything. Even if you don't understand it yet." "I know," Mark said. "The observation comes first. The understanding comes later." "Yes," Leonard said. Another pause. Then Mark said, "I need to tell Clara what the notebooks say." Clara was Mark's daughter. She was 22 years old and had just finished an agriculture degree at the University of Illinois and had come back to the farm, not because she had to but because she had decided she wanted to. "Yes," Leonard said. "Walk her through the fields the way I walked you through them. 3 days. Start with the creek ground." When? Mark said. Don't wait, Leonard said. You never know how much time you have. He set down the phone and looked out the window at the dark fields and the water that was out there somewhere in the March night, rising and spreading across the valley the way water always did in flood years, patient and indifferent, finding the lowest ground, the path of least resistance, the places where the earth was willing to receive it, and the places where it was not. The places where it was not were the places where someone had taken the time, 40 or 60 or 80 years ago, to find what was underneath and to write it down and then to sit with the next person and explain what had been written. The land did not keep those records. The people did. The Great Flood of 1993 is real. The Mississippi River crested at St. Louis at 49.6 feet on August 1, 1993, and the flooding affected approximately 20 million acres across 9 states, causing an estimated $15 billion in damage. In Illinois, the Illinois River Valley and its tributaries experienced severe flooding. Kankakee County was among the affected areas. Drummer silty clay loam is the official state soil of Illinois, a real soil series found across much of the central and northern part of the state, characterized by poor drainage and high productivity when adequately drained. Glacial outwash deposits, gravel and sand deposited by meltwater streams at the edge of receding glaciers, are real and common features of the geology of glaciated terrain in central Illinois. Buried paleofluvial channels of this kind exist in many areas and are not always reflected in county soil surveys, particularly surveys conducted before modern subsurface investigation techniques became standard practice. The knowledge archaeology described in this novel, the systematic effort to find and recover observation-based knowledge held by farming families that is not available in official records, is not a formal practice in most Extension Service contexts, though elements of it appear in ethnobotany, ethnoecology, and traditional ecological knowledge research. It is a real need. Leonard Kessler, Robert Kessler, Dorothy Kessler, Mark Kessler, Paul Dreyer, Ed Garrison, Dr. Margaret Voss, and all other characters are fictional. Kankakee County, Illinois is real. Dorothy's calculation is fictional. The arithmetic it represents is not.